a few stories for you tonight about my boarding school days. And I thought they might be interesting because most of you young people listening wouldn't have been to boarding school. They were kind of gone out of fashion. Lucky for you. But anyway, I have some good and some not so good things to tell you about it. But all I want to say is I want to preface it by saying that when I left, I had achieved everything I needed to go out in life, meet anybody, stand my ground in conversations, business, on the stage, project my voice for acting, which I had also learned in school. So I got a lot out of it, but there was a lot, as you'll see, if you listen on, you'll hear some things that will probably shock you or surprise you. So when I arrived first, I was age 9. I started in September and then I went 10 that November. So I found myself in what was called a prelim class, which was the second last class before first year. There was prelim and prep. And one of the good things we had French girls over. Each of them came for a year. So my 2 years in that junior school, I had oral French from Evelyn Hennessy of the Hennessy Brandy dynasty and another girl called Michelle. And I learned an awful lot of speech French, which stood to me all my life, funnily enough. And it was a very good advantage to have. But of course, when I arrived first, I'm 9, I'm going on 10, and I am so lonely. I get into bed every night and I cry. The pillow was wet. And I was in a junior dorm and the whole lighting system in the whole convent went out at 9:30 and you weren't allowed torches. So it was quite a traumatic experience, for a young one. If you wanted to get out and go to the bathroom or do anything, it was a huge deal. So anyway, that was only one little snag. Also, from the time we went to bed, and in junior school, I think it must have been about 8 o'clock, we were not allowed to talk under any circumstances until after breakfast the next morning, because the bell went, big clanging bell went at about 6:30, I say 20 to 7. And the nun was there and she was saying the morning prayers and we all had to jump out of bed. We had a little basin beside the bed with cold water, which sometimes in the winter would have a little thin sheet of ice on it because the dorms are very cold. But I still managed to sleep, get down under, snuggle under my adequate bedclothes, which my mother had supplied. I also had to bring my own cutlery and it had to be silver and it had to be initialed. And by the way, I never got it back. Then we had uniforms which came from Switzer's, red for Sundays and holy days and blue for daily, and cardigans, jumpers to match, and everything had to be marked with a little tag with your name on it. So yeah, it was quite a big expense and it was a big sacrifice for Mummy. Running her own business and, she was doing well, but she could have been spending more on herself and Daddy and having more holidays than they did. But no, she decided it would be good to give me the opportunity, and later on Elizabeth followed. So anyway, it was pretty tough, particularly when you weren't allowed to go out of the place. You weren't allowed down the town or sort of mix with anybody. The day girls came in, day pupils, and they wore a different uniform. They wore navy, and we weren't encouraged to be friends with them, which it wasn't very nice because it kind of brought a little bit of class distinction in somehow, which it certainly irritated me. And of course I talked to them because everything that was there that I didn't agree with, I broke the rule, but I paid for it. But anyway, for example, now, I had the same teacher for Irish for the 6 years of the senior school. And every month we had a monthly report. And if you didn't pass Irish, say you got 6 honours and you failed Irish, you went to the back of the class. So I found myself, we had a nun called Sister Mary de Chantal. We used to call her Sean T. And every month I got a big F on my page for fail. And that went on for 6 years. And the outcome of that at the end was that I learned all the Irish off by heart. And of course, in the middle of our second year, they changed the whole language. They put in new spellings, new pronunciations, which didn't help. But anyway, struggled on. But anyway, as I say, I still failed. And so when I got to the leaving, as I was saying earlier, I had everything learnt off, poems, compositions, you name it. And I got a very high mark. And when I went down later, after I'd left school, and I had, I think, Philip and Lisa, Noel and I went down, there was a big fancy fair going on. So I brought the children. Connor wasn't born at that stage. And I met Shanti, Sister Mary de Shant, and she said, oh, I'm absolutely amazed, she said, to see your results in Irish in the leaving. She said, my goodness, she said. I said, oh, well, I can explain that to your sister. And she said, oh, how? Well, I said, you see, they read my paper. And she said, pardon? I said, yeah, they read it. Obviously, every month you looked at it and you saw Dorothy Ledwidge and you just put a big F and a line through the pages, and that was it. So anyway, she was very taken aback. I think she said, oh God, this one has left school, but she's still as bad as ever. So anyway, that was one little story. And then I brought back a book one time, and we had this, I think she was called the Sister for Discipline. I can't remember the actual title. Her name was Sister Markeline, but actually she was quite with it and well up on, how to deal with girls, which was great. But I brought this novel back anyway, and so she confiscated it from me. And then she said, I want to see you this evening. She said, I want to discuss something in the novel with you. And I said, oh my God, what have I missed? So anyway, it was a perfectly innocent little romance. And so she opens the page and she has it marked, and it said, they kissed. And then he said to her, kiss me properly. And then the nun said, now, you know what that properly means? I said, no, sister. Well, she said, it means improperly. And I said, oh, and that's different. I hadn't got a clue. I didn't know anything about kissing except the fella put his lips on yours, and providing they were dry, it wasn't too bad. But other than that, you wouldn't be interested. But anyway, it was so funny. I came out and I said to the girls, I've learned a new way to kiss. And they were all aghast. Tell us about it. So that was just one little story. But then after, I was there a couple of years, I think it must have been about 12, 13. And the same nun, Sister Markeline, I said to her one day, could I go down the town to get my hair washed and set? Bearing in mind we were not allowed outside the gates of the school. And so we were locked in, so you couldn't go down and peruse around and buy yourself a couple of toffee bars. Anyway, she got such a shock. She looked at me and she said, you certainly may. I said, oh. She said, I'm 40 years a nun, and you're the first girl that's ever asked to go to the hairdressers, and certainly you may go. Wasn't that hilarious? So the others were all saying to me, you B, how did you manage it? I'm sailing off and taking orders for all their toffee bars, which I had to smuggle in down the front of my gym slip. And I made a girdle belt to hold it up. I certainly gained a lot of posture by the time I came back with all these toffee bars, usually about 7 or 8. But that was just another little story of my life there. So then in the dorm, we'd have a lot of study. We had 2 hours in the afternoon from 4 to half 4 to half 6. And then we had supper. And then after that, we had dancing or exercises before we went to bed. So we went to bed after 9, I think it must have been about 9:15, and we were not allowed to open our mouths from that time until after breakfast in the morning. So at 7:30 every morning, the big clanging bell, the nun would come in and she'd shake the bell and she'd be waking us up. And we had to get out of bed, and we had little basins beside the bed with the cold water in them. And sometimes there was a thin sheet of ice on top because it was very, very cold. This, mind you, was during the war, the end of the war. So it was 1948, maybe it was just nearly over, but they couldn't get coal or much stuff to heat the oil. the oil-fired radiators. But anyway, we managed and we survived. A little bit of hardship doesn't do you much good. Bad. That was a Freudian slip. But anyway, then there was another very strict rule. You could not open your mouth after lights out, which was about, I think, 9:30. So I found that, say, the girl is behind me, her bed would be her head up to my head, and she'd be making signs that she wanted something, and I'd say, what are you looking for? So in other words, I'd be talking, she wouldn't be breaking any rules, and invariably I was caught. And when you were caught speaking, you had to take your mattress and move to a junior dorm. Go down. There was 4 dorms. There was junior, middle year, senior, and then eventually there was a place called Heaven, which there were rooms for 4. When you were in 6th year, you got up there if you were very well behaved. So I spent my life moving. Probably in each term, I did probably about 3 moves. And the girls used to be laughing. They said, what did you do now? But anyway, it made life interesting and made times go quicker, so I didn't really mind. But then an incident happened to me which was very, very memorable and very serious to me. I was down in the hotel with my parents on Sunday, the Grand Hotel, and Mummy had always warned us, don't talk about the school when you're in the hotel. Keep anything you have to say till when you're in the car. So we walked in and we met this girl out of my class with her mother, right in the hall of the hotel at the end of a staircase. I can still remember it. And her name was Mimi. So anyway, Mimi's mother proceeds to say to my mother, oh my goodness, that place is a concentration camp, that school. And she went on and on and on, and I had my mouth tight shut, and Mummy didn't answer either. So anyway, that was that. But the next day, I'm called up by Sister Eucharia, and she was a Wicklow girl herself, brought up in Wicklow, and very, very narrow-minded. So anyway, she said to me, I want to talk to you. So she brought me up to what was the infirmary, and she sat down on a tiny little stool opposite me, and she started to pray over me, and she said, now, I want to ask God to give you the strength to tell the truth. So she proceeded to tell me what I had said about the school being a concentration camp. So I said, oh no, sister, definitely I never said any such thing. Absolutely denied it. So she said, well, I'm going to leave you here now, and you'll sleep in here, and your meals will be brought up until such time as you decide you're going to own up and tell the truth. So I was there on my own. All the other girls in the school must have thought, what did she do? She's locked up in the infirmary. My meals left outside the door. But I just took the opportunity. I said, I'll catch up on some study I wanted to do and read some books. And it was nice and peaceful. I didn't mind. And a senior girl came in at night. She was the only person I would have seen all day except the nun. And she never spoke one word to me. I couldn't believe it. This girl would be about 4 or 5 years older than me. She would have been a 6th year. But anyway, I never forgot that. So I'm there anyway, and I'm on day 2. And I decide I'm going to write a letter to Mummy, and I'm going to tell her the whole story. So anyway, I asked the nun, I'm missing all my classes, by the way, and all my study. And so I asked her for a pen and paper, and so she brought them to me. So I sat down, and I wrote a letter to Mummy, and I told her exactly what had happened. I said, do you remember when we were in the hotel on Sunday, and Mimi O'Halloran, his mother, was giving out about the school, and you looked at me, cautioned me with your look, and I never spoke, and you never spoke? Well, I'm now locked up in the infirmary because I won't admit that it was me who said all those things. So I said, I'm sure you'll be surprised to hear this, but I know you're very busy, and don't worry about me, I'm fine. Full stop. So I handed up the letter unsealed, the envelope open. So I had completed, I was into day 3 then. She came back and she said, you may come out now. So I said, oh. So she said, so she took me out of the room anyway, outside, and she said, you may rejoin the school. And she said, you'll find when you go out in life that even judges sometimes make a mistake. But these are things you have to live with and get on with your life. In other words, no apology, no taking back what she said. So she just said, now you may rejoin your class. So, of course, by the time I got down to the girls in the class, they were all aghast. What did you do? You were locked up for 3 days. So I told them in front of the girl who was sitting in the class that I'd been locked up for. She never mentioned it. She never went to the nun, and the nun never said anything to her. It was not an amazing thing, but it kind of showed me that the nun didn't like me, and she was kind of quite happy to punish me. But these things are all part of the making of your character, and if you survive that, you'll survive anything. And I survived it, thank God. And Mummy didn't get the letter, but the teacher who had reported it discovered later that I had been locked up, and she knew immediately that it wasn't me at all. So she went to the nun and told her that wasn't Dorothy who said that. So anyway, Mummy got such a shock when she heard the teacher went into the shop in Mary Street and asked to see Mummy and told her. And Mummy said, why did you never tell me? So I said I didn't want to worry you, and I coped with it. So I think Mummy was happy for me that I'd managed to cope with something so difficult and it hadn't broken my spirit. It would take a lot more than that. So that anyway, I got on with my life, and that was just one of a long series of episodes. But that was actually the most traumatic. That would have been about the worst thing that happened, I'd say. But, this is life, and as I say, it didn't break my spirit. And then one of the nuns, the Dean of Discipline, she used to read out the headings out of the Independent at lunchtime every day. We weren't allowed to talk through meal times, just as well, because we would have been complaining so much about the food. It would have made a racket. Anyway, so she read out the headlines, and then this particular day, she goes over to the property page and she calls out the name of a house called Clarebeg in Shankhill. And she said, oh, Clarebeg and Shankhill is on the market. Now, this was one of my close friends, Anne Shorter. This was her family home. And she had no inkling that things were not going well with her parents. She knew nothing. And the first thing she heard about it was when the nun read out at the lunchtime that Clarebeg, Shankhill, was on the market, and her face was stricken. She was so upset. So I didn't even wait for the dessert to be served. I went up to the nun and I said, Sister, do you realise what you've done? And she said, oh yes, well, I always read out the news so that you girls are educated to what's going on. And I said, well, did Anne Shortall have to hear from you in public about that her parents were splitting up? She looked at me aghast. I'd say she was ready to kill me, but she said nothing. So anyway, I consoled Anne and we got over it, because you're young, you get over these things. But I thought it was a very cruel thing to do, And yet that nun wasn't a cruel nun. But why she did it, I will never to my dying day know. So that's just another little story. But as I say, I've no regrets having spent my time there, because I came out of it and I was at home in Selbridge and I had the radio on one morning, and Gay Byrne was talking about boarding schools, and he was talking about boys in boarding schools. So I rang them up and I said, do you know there were girls? And they said, would you talk? And I said, oh yeah, try and stop me. So anyway, Mommy and Daddy were in Dunleary, and they always listened to the Gay Byrne show in the morning, and it was all chat like what I'm going to tell you now. So they rang me anyway, and of course I couldn't ring Mummy then to tell her I'm on the radio. But she and Daddy happened to be making the bed, and so Gay says to me, oh, and Dorothy, and you went to boarding school. Would you like to talk about it? And I said, oh, yes. And Mummy said, oh, my God, that's Dorothy. And Daddy, so they sat down on the bed anyway, and I told them I didn't say very bad things, I just told them a few things, and emphasised the good things, like the good drama I got, and training, for speaking out and all those sort of things, additional to your school that you would get, your normal school. So anyway, the two of them ended up in tears, because I said during the interview, I said, and there's one thing that's never mentioned, the sacrifice our parents made to send us, I know that the fees were so high that my mum could have had a new fur coat, or she could have had a nice holiday when we were at school. But no, she didn't. And she didn't begrudge it or regret it. So they were in tears. Mummy said the pair of them were sitting there on the bed saying, oh my God, isn't that lovely? So that was one good thing I did anyway, was to kind of talk to him in public on the radio and explain a lot of what I'm telling you, not the bad things. I didn't tell him too many of them, just an odd one. So it was very interesting. It's part of your education, you know. It's funny, I suppose you'd say funny type of education. But anyway, so you probably at this stage are wondering, well, why did you stick it out? Why didn't you leave? So anyway, when I was about, I think, 14, or maybe less, I might have been 12, my two sisters at home got the mumps, and it was after the Christmas holidays and I was in quarantine. So I used the opportunity to talk to Mummy. I said to her, I really don't want to go back to Wicklow. And she said, oh, why? So I said, well, I'm just finding it very lonely and I don't really want to go. So she said, okay, well, we'll look at another option. So she goes down to the Loretta Abbey in Rathfarn, a very posh school, day school. And at this stage now, you know, I'm well established in Wicklow and I've been there a couple of years. So anyway, she gets me in for the week to try it out. Or well, she wasn't thinking of a week. She was thinking I was going to be there and that was it. So the nuns said, yes, it doesn't matter. You needn't buy the uniform. We'll just see how she gets on. So coming to the end of the week, I said, oh, Mummy, I'm missing all my friends. I want to go back to Wicklow. And she was shocked. She said, well, I am surprised to hear that change. Well, she said, fine, you can go back, but that's the last I want to hear about you leaving until you finish your 6 years. So then the next time was 2 years after that. I was going into 5th year and I said, could I leave? I've done my inter now and I've got my inter certificate. That was, what's it called now? JC. And she said, yes, you can leave. She said, and the type of job you would expect to get with your qualifications would be maybe a messenger girl with a bike on front doing deliveries. Or maybe you could work in Uncle Michael's factory at one of the machines. And I was horrified. I said, oh my God, I want to do something more than that. So she just calmly said, well, then you better go back and finish your leaving. So that was to me, looking back on it, a very intelligent way of handling, letting me feel I could leave if I wanted to, but take the consequences I would have to. So I stayed on and did my leaving. And earlier when I was talking about the long study times, I of course forgot that after supper at 7, we had another hour until 8 of study. So that made 3 solid hours a day of study, which was all right if you were 15, 16 and doing the big exams. But as a young one, it was painful. But I managed to slip in reading a few books, sneaking them out of my desk. So so that's all the story for now. And I hope you enjoyed this little diatribe. Okay, bye-bye.